Hello, welcome to our behavior change project. This group includes Amanda, Andrea, Brittany, Karis, Ashley, and Valerie. Our topic for this project was reduction in social media usage.
So the purpose of our replication of the Stinson and Dallery study was to evaluate if the use of setting application limits on iPhones, as well as using alternative activities, would reduce social media usage within the participants. So on to our methods section. For this replication, we had 6 female participants that ranged in age from 23 to 46 years old. To be a part of this replication, all of the participants needed to be enrolled in a master's level course at Ball State University, specifically in SPCE 611, Advanced Applied Behavior Analysis. All participants must also reside in the Central Time Zone. And one last requirement for our participants was that they needed to have access to an internet-enabled iPhone with app limitations features turned on. So the setting for our replication of the study was being performed by students online or on an online course through Ball State. So the main setting was through Google Meet, and that was where meetings were held for the group to discuss the study, to discuss treatment integrity, as well as to kind of rally on the fellow participants and to keep trying to keep their screen times down for the study.
For the materials of the study, all participants used their internet-enabled iPhone to track their social media usage. Additionally, all participants had the Screen Time app downloaded and turned on. A social media survey was also used prior to participants starting the study in order to give us a better idea about everyone's social media habits. The behavior that was tracked in this study was social media usage, and our social media use reduction was the target behavior. The definition of social media use is defined as any instance where the participant engages with an application meant for social interaction and content sharing, such as TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and X. An example of that would be participants scrolling through their likes and images shared by other friends on Instagram, taking pictures on Snapchat, or scrolling through TikTok. A non-example would be participants using the text messaging app or FaceTime app, since we were not including text message or FaceTime.
We collected data for 5 days on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And all of our participants reported their social media usage and the total duration in minutes. And the social media usage was referenced in the built-in Screen Time app on our settings on our iPhones. And only the social category was reported. And text messaging and GroupMe was subtracted from the total number of minutes because the participants use that for other things other than social media. The design, we used a multiple baseline design, and our project consisted of a pre-baseline, baseline, app limitation 1, a baseline 2, and an app limitation 2, consistent with Stinson and Dallery. And all participants set the first 5 days of data collection for the pre-baseline phase, and the stability of the data determined all other phase change decisions.
During the pre-baseline phase, each participant completed 2 surveys. The social media survey allowed us to collect an estimate of the amount of hours spent on social media prior to the beginning of the study when participants knew that data was being collected. The second survey was the behavior allocation survey, which allowed us to make note of the additional activities that would be implemented in place of spending time on social media. The last step before baseline was over, each participant agreed to enable screen time tracking on their mobile devices in order to collect the required data. When we entered the baseline phase, each participant began their data collection on the same day, which was February 18th. After this date, each participant collected data for the next 5 days, 2/18 through 2/22. This was done in the same way across all participants. Data collection included a screenshot of times, which included the data usage from smartphones being tracked, and data was converted to total minutes of screen time per day to create data points on the graph. Our treatment phases included baseline, implementation 1, baseline, and implementation 2. During the baseline phase, participants will collect raw data prior to any limitations being set. There will be no limitations and data will just be collected at the end of the day or following morning for most accurate results. The screenshots will be saved for future reference to create data points on the graph. The baseline phase will consist of 5 data points and is the only phase with consistent days across participants. When you enter the first treatment phase, you will begin to change according to how effective the treatment procedure was for participant. This next phase is called app limitations 1. Each participant will set a personal goal of allotted time on frequently used social media apps. Data will be collected the same way across days. However, it may include more than 5 data points if the participant required additional treatment time to see results. The second baseline phase, the limitations will again be removed to collect raw data on unrestricted use of social media apps. Then our treatment phase called app limitations 2 will include another set of limitations on the app in hopes to reflect a bigger, more effective change than the first treatment phase. This data will be collected across participants in the same way as the other phases, but again, the number of data collections may differ due to results of the participants.
Now we're on to IOA. IOA in our study was calculated throughout our interventions on the following days. March 6th, March 7th, 11th, 13th, 17th, 20th, 26th, 31st, as well as April 3rd and April 8th. For IOA, we sent weekly reminders on Mondays to uphold requirements and standards, as well as answer any questions or anything that kind of needed to be discussed during this time. We either met through Google Meet or we met through GroupMe and just kind of sent a text message. Participants were held to expectations of submitting their social media usage as a screenshot through Google Drive, which was monitored by Ashley. We had specific daily breakdown screenshots that were required when IOA data was taken. And in those specific screenshots, we're able to see a better breakdown as to what apps were being used throughout those times. Next, we have treatment integrity. So treatment integrity was taken sporadically throughout the intervention. They were taken on February 29th, March 14th, March 28th, April 7th, and April 10th. Treatment integrity included screen time software that was built into our phones that everybody was required to have turned on and downloaded when completing the intervention. We also did progress check-ins to see how everybody was keeping up with their data. We made sure that the software was fully working each time that we had this check-in. So if there was any little hiccup, we kind of caught it early on.
So on to our results. So here's a graph that displays the duration in minutes that I was using social media on my phone. So during pre-baseline, I was at a medium level with not a lot of variability within my data and zero trend, but that quickly changed once I went into baseline. So during my first baseline phase, there was an increase in duration of social media usage, but it went on a downward trend from a high level to a low level. So then during app limitations 1, I stayed around a low level but had a slight increase in trend for 2 of my data points, but that again decreased my trend again. So during my second baseline, there was another increase in my trend right at the start of the phase, but it again started to decrease, and it stayed decreasing for 3 data points, which is why I decided to move into my second app limitations phase. And during this phase is kind of when I saw more of a functional relationship start to build within my graph. I stayed in the lower level and had almost no variability within my data. And I also noticed that I was on a 0 trend. Overall, I don't think I was really that strict with myself throughout the first baseline and app limitations. I think once I started putting my graph together more, I noticed that I wasn't taking this as seriously as I could have. And I think a lot of this was due to the limitations that we will discuss later on in the study. But as you can see, towards the end, my social media did start to decrease throughout each day of our study. So
The next graph is mine, and I think you'll find a lot of similar trends across all the participants. The pre-baseline was starting to show a downward trend, which is when I switched in, well, we all switched into baseline at the same time, but thankfully that was moving in a better direction at that point, and then there was some variability across baseline 1. The app limitations 1 phase stayed fairly low comparatively, but there was a little bit more variability in the data, ranging from a low of about 16 to a high of about 30, 31. In baseline 2, when I stopped paying attention, you can see that the trend line was a little bit higher, kind of trending up from 31 to closer to 45 minutes. And then in the app limitations phase 2, when I was really concentrating on trying to keep it low, the numbers stayed much closer to under 20 minutes for most of the time. There was a little bit more variability in the middle, but with more concentration on staying off of social media, I was able to keep those numbers down pretty low. Yeah.
Next graph shows my data. When taking a look at my graph, this visual kind of is able to show that my intervention was not very effective. The social media limits that I had set were either too high or continually ignored. Through my baseline, I did see a little bit of a decrease, but through app limitations 1 and baseline 2, the level was very high. The variability increased in app limitations 2 as well. And then I did kind of see a decrease towards the end of app limitations 2 when things started to kind of set in. However, overall, this intervention was not very effective in my social media usage data.
Valerie, could you turn your mic on?
So I think that Valerie is having a little bit of trouble getting back on, and we need to rectify that. In the meantime, you can take a look at her graph, and she actually shows a little bit more effectiveness from the app limits, with her baseline rising much higher and then her app limits time being considerably lower, both from baseline 1 to app limits 1 and then baseline 2 to app limits 2. You might even say that there was a functional relationship for her when the app limits were set, and her data shows a little bit more variability between phases than some of the other ones do.
Hi. Okay, so I'm back. Sorry about those issues. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, so I did there was definitely a lot more variability within my last intervention phase. But I found myself that when I saw the app limitation, like the screen time to kind of disable my social media applications, I was trying to find alternate ways to stay busy so that I wasn't trying to go back in to bypass that limitation.
So next is my graph. So for the pre-baseline, I started pretty high at around 400 minutes, and I was on a downward trend to about 150. And then my second baseline was a little bit lower. So I decided to move on to my first intervention for the app limits. And as you can see, it kind of skyrocketed up on an upward trend to closer to 500 minutes for one day, and then went on a downward trend for the rest of the intervention. Then I decided to move into baseline, and it was kind of variable throughout the entire baseline intervention. I stayed in baseline for quite a bit until I went on a downward trend for my last data points till about a little bit above 50 minutes. And then in my last intervention phase, I stayed pretty low. And that's when I had more stable data towards the end, and I kind of took it a little bit more serious. And yeah.
So for my pre-baseline, I went up to like 200 minutes and it started to decrease. So when it got to the lowest point, I switched, well, we all switched to the baseline at the same time. And it was very variable. It started very low and it just kept going up. So I decided to switch phases when I was at the highest I could possibly be. Then I moved to my app limitations, and when the limitations were set, it began very high, but then it started to decrease, but it was still very variable. And I decided to switch when I just kind of had low data. Then when I went to my second baseline, it kind of stayed in the middle. It still variable, but it didn't go as high as the first baseline. And in my second app limitation, I started to take it seriously at about 2 data points, but it was still variable and still high. And I don't think this intervention worked for me at all.
So in conclusion, you can see the average minutes that were spent during the pre-baseline phase, which was almost 218 minutes for the group. During baseline 1, the group average was 200 minutes. During treatment phase 1 or app limitations phase 1, the group average was 418 minutes. During baseline 2, the group average was 278 minutes. And finally, during our second treatment phase or app limitations phase, the group average was just under 100 minutes. It's kind of interesting to look at the numbers and see that really the phase that had the highest number of minutes was our first treatment phase, and then but our second treatment phase was considerably lower than every other phase. I think the overall intent to limit and control social media was greatest during our final treatment phase, and that was partially to I think you heard each of us say along the way that we were really taking it seriously during that last phase and seeing that the trends were not going the direction we wanted to until we got to the last treatment phase, and wanted to show some attempt to limit our social media use and make that reflect in our project. I think from this, we learned that, with concentration and support, we're perhaps more likely to be able to control our social media use, but there has to be a desire to make that happen. It's not just going to happen because people are doing it for a project or whatnot. It's pretty prevalent in our world, and people are easily attracted to social media and using their phones to engage and perhaps to be distracted from other things. So it is definitely a challenging problem for many of us. And as we went through the study, we did find that there were limitations. I think the first one was in the original study, the participants were incentivized with money. And I would venture to say that many people are more incentivized with money than without it. We did not have the same incentives, and I think that that lowered our drive to really control our social media use. It also meant that the replication of the study is a little bit questionable without that piece of it. I also think that when individuals are responsible for their own data tracking and checking, that it leaves some room for error. It's not a hard and fast system for making sure that all data is accurate and well collected, since people are responsible for their own information. I think that because this was a group project across the country, that added its own challenges. Everybody has, very different schedules and different lives, and being able to connect and support each other is certainly more of a challenge in a situation like this than if we had all been in a similar place and maybe could have checked in more in a face-to-face way instead of just online all the time. And finally, I think the smartphone addiction is bigger than just social media use. If you were to look at our actual screen time usage, you would see much, much higher numbers than just the social media use. And it's easy to attribute some of that to work. I use my phone for work. I use my phone for this, for communication. But the fact is that a lot of us spend a lot of time on our phones, and just focusing on social media use and trying to limit that doesn't necessarily keep people from being on their phones for hours during the day. And I think that that's another limitation to the study, and certainly what the study is trying to prove.
So lastly, we have our supporting literature. So we found 4 articles on top of our replicated study, and they all show a significant decrease in social media, each having their own purpose for the study that differentiates from ours, but their main goal within across each of these articles was to decrease social media. We saw this with variations in their interventions. So that kind of supported that there was like incentives for some of them, which supported our study within the incentives. There was also just a significant decrease within each of their limitations for their studies.
And that was our project. Thank you for listening.